Dust rose behind the caravans moving across the ancient roads of Canaan, while cities traded goods, kings expanded territories, families built legacies, and entire civilizations measured success through land, wealth, alliances, and influence. Yet scattered across that same landscape were individuals whose lives followed a completely different pattern. They walked the same roads, but never seemed fully connected to the world around them. They lived among nations, but carried a sense of distance from the ambitions that drove those nations. They participated in history, while simultaneously appearing detached from it. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout Scripture, not as an isolated anomaly, but as a recurring feature of those set apart for divine purposes. Long before they understood their calling, many of them experienced a strange separation from the values, priorities, and attachments that shaped the societies around them. Their lives unfolded within the same geography as everyone else, yet their inner orientation pointed somewhere beyond the visible horizon. The story begins in Mesopotamia, within the prosperous urban centers surrounding the Euphrates River. There, among established trade routes and organized settlements, lived Abraham. The world around him measured stability through inheritance, family position, and connection to ancestral lands. Yet the defining moment of his life arrived through departure. He was not called to strengthen his attachment to the world he knew. He was called to leave it. The route from Ur toward Haran, and eventually into Canaan, was not merely a migration across territory. It was the beginning of a pattern that would echo through generations. Geography became the visible expression of an invisible reality. The chosen were repeatedly moved away from what appeared secure. Every mile traveled increased the distance between them and the systems that defined ordinary life. Abraham entered regions he had never known. The landscapes changed, the customs changed, the rulers changed. Yet the deeper transformation occurred within. The familiar structures that once anchored identity gradually lost their hold. This detachment was not rooted in hatred for the world. It emerged from the recognition that the world could not provide what had been promised. Centuries later, the descendants of Abraham would experience a similar process on a much larger scale. Egypt stood as one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Along the Nile River, immense agricultural wealth supported cities, temples, military campaigns, and administrative systems that seemed permanent. Generations of Israelites lived there. They worked there. They raised families there. Yet the defining chapter of their history involved departure. The Exodus transformed an entire nation into travelers. The route from the Nile Delta toward the Sinai Peninsula became one of the most significant movements in biblical history. What makes this journey remarkable is not only its scale but also its purpose. The wilderness functioned as a place of separation. There were no great cities. There were no monuments to human achievement. There were no thriving marketplaces filled with distractions. Across barren terrain, the people learned what remained when worldly structures disappeared. Day after day, the landscape reinforced the lesson. Sand stretched toward the horizon. Rocky valleys cut through mountains. Empty expanses surrounded every camp. The environment itself seemed designed to loosen attachment to earthly securities. Detachment often develops in similar ways among the chosen. The process rarely feels comfortable. It usually begins through disruption. Familiar routines lose their appeal. Ambitions that once seemed important begin to feel strangely hollow. Social environments that once provided satisfaction no longer produce the same sense of belonging. The individual remains physically present within the world, yet internally something has shifted. The goals celebrated by society no longer generate the same enthusiasm. The conversations that captivate others seem repetitive. The endless pursuit of status, recognition, accumulation, and approval starts to reveal its limitations. Scripture repeatedly portrays this condition through the lives of those called into unique purposes. Joseph experienced it in dramatic fashion. His story moved across vast geographical distances. From Canaan, he was transported into Egypt. From favored son, he became a slave. From slave, he became a prisoner. From prisoner, he rose to administrative authority. Throughout these transitions, Joseph repeatedly found himself disconnected from the environment surrounding him. His brothers misunderstood him, Foreign masters controlled him, fellow prisoners forgot him. Yet beneath every change in circumstance remained an invisible thread directing his journey. The world evaluated his life according to immediate appearances. Heaven viewed it according to a larger timeline. This difference between visible reality and divine purpose often creates the sensation of detachment. The chosen begin perceiving events through a framework that differs from the surrounding culture. While others focus entirely on present conditions, they sense connections stretching across years, decades, and generations. Moses provides another example. Raised within Egypt's royal structures, he possessed access to power, education, and influence. Yet despite occupying one of the most privileged positions available, he never fully belonged to that world. The courts of Pharaoh represented prestige and authority, but Moses eventually departed into the wilderness of Midian. For decades he lived far from the centers of civilization. Shepherding flocks across isolated terrain became preparation for a future mission. Geography again mirrors spiritual reality. The mountains, deserts, and remote valleys formed an environment where worldly attachments gradually weakened. When the moment of calling arrived near Horeb, Moses was already far removed from the ambitions dominating imperial Egypt. Throughout biblical history, mountains frequently become settings for encounters that redefine perspective. From Sinai to Carmel, from Nebo to the Mount of Olives, elevated places symbolize distance from ordinary concerns. Standing above cities, roads, and crowds creates a different view of reality. The chosen often experience something similar internally. They begin seeing human activity from a broader vantage point. Daily competitions for recognition lose significance. Temporary trends lose influence. Urgent cultural obsessions appear smaller when viewed against the backdrop of eternity. This shift does not always produce comfort. In many cases, it produces loneliness. Elijah understood this deeply. His ministry unfolded during periods of political instability and spiritual compromise within the northern kingdom of Israel. Surrounded by widespread idolatry, he frequently stood apart from prevailing currents. His journeys carried him through Samaria, Mount Carmel, the wilderness south of Judah, and eventually toward Horeb. Again and again, geographical isolation accompanied spiritual purpose. The prophet often found himself removed from crowds, institutions, and social approval. His experience illustrates a recurring reality. Detachment from the world does not necessarily mean physical separation from humanity. More often, it means separation from collective illusions. The chosen frequently recognize the fragility of things others assume are permanent. They understand how quickly kingdoms rise and fall. They see how rapidly wealth disappears. They observe how public opinion shifts. History itself becomes evidence. The empires dominating one century become ruins in another. The cities considered invincible eventually collapse. The leaders once feared by nations fade into memory. Biblical narratives repeatedly highlight this pattern. Babylon rose, Babylon fell. Assyria rose, Assyria fell. Egypt flourished, Egypt declined. Rome expanded, Rome weakened. Against this backdrop, the chosen gradually develop an awareness that transcends immediate circumstances. Their sense of identity becomes less dependent upon temporary structures. The life of Daniel illustrates this phenomenon with remarkable clarity. Transported from Jerusalem into Babylon, Daniel lived within one of the most impressive urban centers of the ancient world. Massive walls surrounded the city. Advanced administration organized its operations. Wealth flowed through its streets. Political power radiated outward across vast territories. Yet Daniel remained inwardly detached from the culture surrounding him. He worked within the system but never surrendered his identity to it. Decades passed. Kings changed. Governments shifted, empires evolved. Still, his deepest loyalties remained anchored elsewhere. This capacity to live within the world while remaining distinct from it forms one of the defining characteristics of the chosen throughout Scripture. The New Testament continues the pattern. The ministry of Jesus unfolded across Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and surrounding regions. Roads connected villages. Fishing boats crossed the Sea of Galilee. Pilgrims traveled toward Jerusalem. Crowds gathered around teachers, merchants, and political figures. Yet throughout these movements, a recurring theme emerged. Many people remained focused on earthly expectations while missing the deeper reality unfolding before them. The disciples themselves required time to understand this distinction. They often interpreted events through conventional assumptions regarding power, success, and influence. Gradually, their perspective changed. Journeys across lakes, mountains, deserts, villages, and cities exposed them to a different understanding of reality. After the resurrection, the spread of the early church expanded this pattern across continents. Missionaries traveled through Asia Minor, Greece, Syria, Judea, and eventually toward Rome. The roads of the Roman Empire became channels for a message that consistently challenged worldly priorities. Believers were encouraged to participate responsibly within society while recognizing that their ultimate identity extended beyond it. This tension appears throughout the writings of the apostles. They lived within cities, worked occupations, raised families, and interacted with governments. Yet they continually emphasized a perspective reaching beyond temporary structures. For many chosen individuals, detachment emerges because they begin perceiving life through this larger lens. The world often concentrates attention upon immediate gratification, visible achievement, and social validation. The chosen increasingly sense the limitations of those pursuits. What once seemed deeply important begins to feel strangely incomplete. Achievements arrive yet fail to satisfy. Recognition appears yet quickly fades. Possessions accumulate, yet leave deeper questions unanswered. This experience can be unsettling because it creates distance between the individual and prevailing cultural assumptions. Others may interpret the change as indifference, withdrawal, or lack of ambition. In reality, a reordering of priorities is occurring beneath the surface. Scripture repeatedly demonstrates that those called into significant purposes often pass through seasons where ordinary attachments loosen their grip. During those periods, they may feel disconnected from the values driving the surrounding world. Yet this detachment serves a function. It creates space for a different orientation. Instead of deriving identity from shifting circumstances, they begin deriving it from something more enduring. The deserts of Sinai, the hills of Judea, the valleys of Galilee, the plains of Babylon, the roads of Asia Minor, and the shores of the Mediterranean all testify to the same pattern. Across centuries and continents, the chosen repeatedly traveled through environments that exposed the temporary nature of worldly foundations. Their journeys reveal that detachment is not the absence of purpose. It is often preparation for purpose. It is not rejection of creation. It is recognition that creation itself points beyond its own boundaries. It is not isolation for its own sake. It is the gradual development of perspective. Through movement across geography, through encounters with history, through seasons of wilderness and transition, the chosen learn to see the world differently. They remain present within it, yet no longer defined by it. They walk its roads, inhabit its cities, participate in its history, and contribute to its communities. But their deepest orientation belongs to a reality extending beyond every empire, beyond every generation, and beyond every horizon visible to the human eye. The roads stretching outward from Jerusalem carried merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and rulers toward destinations scattered across the ancient world. Yet among the countless travelers moving through those corridors of history were individuals who increasingly sensed that the world around them could not fully explain the direction of their lives. Their journeys continued through familiar landscapes, but their relationship with those landscapes began to change. What once felt permanent started to appear temporary. What once commanded loyalty began to lose its authority. The process unfolded gradually, often over years rather than days, and Scripture repeatedly presents this transformation through the movement of people across geography, time, and circumstance. The chosen frequently arrived at moments when the structures surrounding them no longer aligned with the deeper reality taking shape within them. This tension can be traced throughout biblical history. After the Israelites entered Canaan, generations settled into towns, cultivated fields, established households, and participated in the rhythms of ordinary life. Yet even during periods of relative stability, reminders of impermanence remained everywhere. The land witnessed cycles of prosperity and decline. Judges rose and fell. Tribal alliances formed and dissolved. External threats appeared from surrounding nations. The history of Israel became a continuous lesson regarding the instability of earthly security. What appeared strong one generation often weakened in the next. The chosen who lived through these transitions learned to view permanence differently. Their confidence increasingly rested beyond the visible institutions around them. This pattern intensified during the era of the kings. Jerusalem emerged as a political and spiritual center. Under David and later Solomon, the kingdom expanded. Fortifications strengthened. Trade increased. Construction projects transformed the landscape. The temple stood as one of the most remarkable structures in the region. To many observers, these developments signaled permanence and national greatness. Yet the biblical narrative consistently directs attention toward a larger reality. Even at the height of prosperity, prophets warned that earthly achievements could never serve as the ultimate foundation of identity. The chosen often recognized this truth before the broader population did. They understood that every human system remained vulnerable to change. Their detachment from worldly certainty did not emerge from pessimism. It emerged from observation. History repeatedly demonstrated that no kingdom, regardless of strength, could remain unchanged forever. The Babylonian conquest eventually confirmed those warnings. Armies crossed deserts and river valleys, cities were besieged, walls were breached, families were displaced. The destruction of Jerusalem represented one of the most significant turning points in biblical history. Entire populations were carried into exile. Familiar landmarks disappeared from daily life. The temple itself was destroyed. For many people, such losses shattered their understanding of reality. Yet within the exile, another pattern emerged. Some individuals discovered that their deepest identity survived even when external structures collapsed. Detachment from the world often develops most rapidly during seasons of disruption because disruption exposes what cannot endure. The rivers of Babylon became witnesses to this transformation. Far from their homeland, the exiles faced a profound question. If everything familiar could be removed, what remained? Scripture repeatedly suggests that the answer involved a reality deeper than geography, government, or social status. The chosen learned that purpose could survive displacement. Calling could survive exile. Faithfulness could survive loss. This perspective fundamentally altered their relationship with the world. They no longer viewed visible circumstances as the final measure of reality. Ezekiel experienced this firsthand. His ministry unfolded among exiles living near the Chebar Canal. The landscape surrounding him differed dramatically from Jerusalem. Foreign architecture dominated the horizon. Foreign rulers controlled the region. Foreign customs shaped daily life. Yet some of the most significant revelations recorded in Scripture occurred precisely within that environment of separation. Geography again reinforced the lesson. Divine purpose was not confined to the places people assumed were essential. The chosen often discover that purpose follows them into unexpected locations. The very environments that seem disconnected from destiny frequently become the settings where destiny becomes clearer. Centuries later, another geographical transition would reshape biblical history. The return from exile brought groups of people back toward Jerusalem. Long roads stretched westward across deserts and river systems. Travelers retraced routes their ancestors had taken under entirely different circumstances. Yet the return revealed an important reality. Restoration did not erase detachment. Even after rebuilding efforts began, many recognized that ultimate fulfillment could not be found merely through the recovery of external conditions. The physical city mattered. The land mattered. The community mattered. Yet deeper expectations remained. Throughout the centuries leading toward the arrival of Jesus, this awareness continued developing. Successive empires exercised authority over the region. Persians governed. Greeks expanded influence. Later, Rome established control. Political systems changed. But the fundamental condition of humanity remained unchanged. Many people continued seeking meaning through power, wealth, position, and influence. Others began recognizing that none of those pursuits addressed the deeper longing embedded within the human experience. This distinction forms one of the central themes underlying biblical history. Detachment from the world is not simply emotional distance. It is the recognition that worldly systems cannot satisfy needs they were never designed to fulfill. The ministry of John the Baptist illustrates this transition dramatically. His activity centered around the Jordan River, particularly in wilderness regions east of Jerusalem. Crowds traveled considerable distances to hear him. The setting itself carried symbolic significance. Rather than emerging from centers of political authority or religious prestige, his ministry developed in remote territory. The wilderness once again became a place of preparation. People left familiar environments and entered barren landscapes where distractions diminished. There, many encountered a message directing attention beyond ordinary expectations. The chosen frequently experience similar transitions internally. They may continue living within cities, working occupations, and maintaining responsibilities. Yet something within begins withdrawing allegiance from the assumptions dominating the surrounding culture. This withdrawal is rarely dramatic at first. It often begins as dissatisfaction with explanations that once seemed adequate. Over time, the individual notices that achievements fail to provide lasting fulfillment. Recognition fades quickly. Material success offers temporary satisfaction, but not enduring peace. The world continues presenting opportunities, yet those opportunities no longer appear capable of answering deeper questions. When Jesus began traveling through Galilee, this distinction became increasingly visible. The region contained fishing villages, agricultural communities, trade routes, and growing urban centers. Daily life revolved around practical concerns familiar to every generation. Yet throughout his journeys, a recurring contrast emerged between temporary priorities and eternal realities. Crowds frequently focused on immediate needs. Many sought political change, physical provision, or visible demonstrations of power. Yet the message repeatedly pointed beyond those concerns. The chosen often resonate with this perspective because they increasingly sense that life extends beyond the visible framework dominating ordinary attention. This realization can create feelings of detachment. Conversations centered entirely on status, possessions, competition, or social approval begin feeling incomplete. The individual does not necessarily reject participation in society. Instead, a shift occurs in what they consider ultimately meaningful. The apostles underwent this transformation gradually. Early in their journeys, they often interpreted events through conventional assumptions. Over time, experiences across Judea, Galilee, Samaria, and neighboring regions reshaped their perspective. They witnessed crowds celebrating one day and rejecting the next. They observed public enthusiasm rise and disappear. They saw political authorities exercise power that eventually proved temporary. Through these experiences, their understanding deepened. The world remained important, but it no longer represented the highest reality. After the resurrection, this perspective expanded dramatically as the message spread beyond Palestine. The Mediterranean world connected diverse regions through shipping routes, highways, and commercial networks. Missionaries traveled from city to city, crossing cultural and geographical boundaries. Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, and Rome became stages within a larger historical movement. Many early believers lived in thriving urban centers, surrounded by commerce, entertainment, political activity, and social competition. Yet the writings emerging from these communities reveal a consistent theme. Followers were encouraged to engage responsibly with the world, while recognizing that their ultimate identity rested elsewhere. This distinction often produced tension. Some experienced misunderstanding from family members. Others faced opposition from authorities. Many discovered that their priorities no longer aligned with prevailing cultural values. The sensation of detachment described by countless chosen individuals throughout history frequently mirrors this experience. They observe the same events as everyone else. They occupy the same environments, yet their interpretation differs. Temporary matters no longer appear ultimate. Trends lose their ability to define meaning. Collective anxieties lose some of their influence. The chosen often become aware of broader horizons. History contributes to this awareness. When viewed across centuries, human achievements reveal a recurring cycle. Civilizations expand and contract, economies rise and fall, cultural movements emerge and disappear. Leaders gain prominence and eventually pass into memory. The biblical narrative repeatedly places individual lives against this immense historical backdrop. Doing so changes perspective. A person who recognizes the temporary nature of earthly systems naturally becomes less attached to them. This does not produce apathy. Instead, it often produces clarity. Energy becomes focused on what endures rather than what fades. Detachment from the world, therefore, is not primarily about withdrawal from society. It is about seeing society within a larger context. The chosen frequently feel different because their attention increasingly gravitates toward realities extending beyond immediate circumstances. They continue fulfilling responsibilities. They continue building relationships. They continue participating in communities. Yet beneath those activities exists a growing awareness that human life points towards something greater than itself. Throughout biblical history, deserts, mountains, rivers, cities, roads, and seas all served as stages upon which this awareness developed. The chosen crossed those landscapes generation after generation. Their journeys reveal that detachment is not emptiness. It is not emotional coldness. It is not indifference toward humanity. Rather, it is the gradual recognition that the deepest dimensions of existence cannot be contained within the boundaries of the visible world alone. As this recognition grows, the individual often feels increasingly separated from the assumptions that dominate surrounding culture. What others consider ultimate begins appearing temporary. What others overlook begins appearing essential. The result is a life that remains present within history while simultaneously oriented beyond it. A life shaped by roads that lead through the world but ultimately point toward a destination greater than anything the world itself can offer. Across the centuries, countless roads disappeared beneath shifting sands. Forests reclaimed abandoned settlements. Mighty walls crumbled into scattered stones, and entire civilizations faded from the landscape. Yet the pattern visible throughout biblical history remained remarkably consistent. Those set apart for significant purposes often developed a relationship with the world that differed from the relationship maintained by the majority around them. They inhabited the same era, witnessed the same events, endured the same hardships, and celebrated the same milestones, yet something within them continuously pointed beyond the visible framework that defined ordinary life. This reality becomes even clearer when biblical history is viewed not as isolated stories, but as one continuous movement stretching from the ancient Near East through the Roman world and beyond. Every major geographical transition reinforces the same lesson. Every wilderness crossing, every exile, every migration, every pilgrimage, and every journey reveals how detachment from the world often emerges as part of preparation rather than punishment. The final chapters of Scripture draw this theme together by presenting history itself as a journey moving toward completion. Before reaching that conclusion, however, the biblical narrative repeatedly demonstrates how the chosen learn to navigate life with a perspective shaped by eternity rather than immediate circumstance. Consider the lives of those who followed the apostolic mission across the expanding Roman Empire. They traveled roads connecting provinces that stretched from Judea to Spain, from Syria to Greece, from Egypt to Asia Minor. The Roman system offered unprecedented mobility for its time. Commercial routes linked distant regions. Ports connected continents. Information moved faster than previous generations could have imagined. Yet despite living within a sophisticated and interconnected world, many early believers increasingly recognized the limitations of every earthly system. They observed corruption within governments, instability within economies, and uncertainty within human institutions. These observations did not drive them into despair. Instead, they deepened their understanding that no human structure could permanently resolve the fundamental condition of humanity. Detachment emerged not because the world lacked value, but because the world could not fulfill expectations beyond its design. This distinction remains essential throughout biblical history. The chosen are not portrayed as individuals who reject creation. They are portrayed as individuals who recognize the difference between creation and ultimate reality. This awareness often produces a sense of distance from prevailing cultural assumptions. While others become consumed by temporary victories and defeats, the chosen increasingly view events through a broader timeline. They learn to place present circumstances within a much larger story. This perspective appears repeatedly in prophetic literature. The prophets frequently stood at moments of national crisis. Empires threatened borders, armies approached cities, political alliances shifted rapidly, economic conditions fluctuated, yet their messages consistently expanded the horizon beyond immediate concerns. They interpreted contemporary events within a framework extending across generations and even centuries. The chosen often experience a similar expansion of perspective. They begin noticing how much energy society invests in matters that ultimately pass away. They observe how intensely people pursue recognition that quickly fades, possessions that eventually deteriorate, and positions that inevitably change hands. Over time, this observation alters priorities. The individual remains engaged with life, but becomes less dependent upon temporary outcomes for identity and meaning. One of the clearest examples of this reality appears in the final years of the Apostle Paul. His journeys carried him across enormous distances. He traveled by foot, by ship, and along some of the most important transportation routes of the ancient world. He visited thriving cities filled with commerce, education, philosophy, and political influence. Yet the trajectory of his life reveals increasing freedom from dependence upon external conditions. Success did not define him, failure did not destroy him, popularity did not sustain him, opposition did not stop him. His identity became anchored beyond the shifting circumstances surrounding him. This represents one of the most profound dimensions of biblical detachment. The chosen gradually become less controlled by conditions that normally govern human behavior. Their stability originates from a deeper source. As a result, they often appear different from those around them. The world typically teaches individuals to attach their sense of worth to achievement, approval, security, or influence. Scripture repeatedly presents an alternative orientation. The chosen learn that none of those foundations remain stable indefinitely. History itself confirms this lesson. The cities that dominated the ancient world now exist primarily as archaeological sites. Great palaces have become ruins. Military powers have vanished. Economic centers have shifted repeatedly. Every generation witnesses change, yet most people continue behaving as though current conditions will last forever. The chosen frequently sense the temporary nature of these structures long before others recognize it. This awareness creates emotional and psychological distance from the relentless pursuit of worldly validation. Many begin feeling detached because they no longer derive meaning from the same sources that motivate the surrounding culture. Their conversations change, their interests evolve, their understanding of success transforms. This process can feel isolating because society often assumes that fulfillment must be found through the accumulation of visible accomplishments. When someone begins looking beyond those accomplishments, misunderstanding frequently follows. Yet biblical history suggests that this misunderstanding is neither unusual nor accidental. Again and again, individuals called into significant purposes found themselves out of alignment with prevailing expectations. Noah lived differently from the society around him. Abraham departed from familiar structures. Joseph carried a vision others could not understand. Moses left the power of Egypt behind. Elijah stood against dominant cultural currents. Daniel remained faithful within a foreign empire. The apostles followed a path few anticipated. Each example reveals some form of separation from ordinary assumptions. The separation was not identical in every case, but the underlying principle remained consistent. The chosen often see reality through a lens shaped by a larger horizon. Geography reinforces this truth throughout Scripture. Mountains symbolize perspective. Wildernesses symbolize preparation. Rivers symbolize transition. Roads symbolize movement. Cities symbolize human achievement and organization. Repeatedly, the biblical narrative moves individuals through these environments as though history itself is teaching them to distinguish between what is temporary and what endures. The chosen frequently discover that detachment develops during seasons of transition. It emerges while crossing unfamiliar territory. It deepens during periods of uncertainty. It strengthens when previous sources of security prove insufficient. Over time, what initially felt like loss begins revealing itself as clarity. What initially felt like distance begins revealing itself as perspective. What initially felt like isolation begins revealing itself as preparation. The closing visions of Scripture elevate this theme to its highest level. The final chapters describe history moving toward fulfillment. The imagery shifts beyond individual nations and empires toward a universal horizon. Earthly structures that once appeared permanent are shown to be temporary. Human power reaches its limits. Historical cycles approach completion. The narrative expands beyond local geography into a cosmic scale. In this context, the detachment experienced by the chosen throughout history becomes easier to understand. They were never being prepared merely for participation in temporary systems. They were being prepared to understand reality from a broader vantage point. Their journeys through deserts, mountains, valleys, rivers, and cities served a purpose extending beyond their immediate circumstances. Every transition taught them to loosen their dependence upon things that could not endure. Every season of separation refined their ability to distinguish between appearance and reality. Every encounter with uncertainty strengthened their awareness of what remained constant beneath changing conditions. This is why so many chosen individuals throughout history describe feeling detached from the world, even while continuing to live within it. The sensation often reflects an internal shift in orientation. The person begins valuing different things. Different questions become important. Different goals emerge. The metrics used by society no longer carry the same weight. Success becomes defined differently. Failure becomes interpreted differently. Time itself begins to feel different because life is viewed against a larger backdrop. The chosen recognize that every generation occupies only a brief chapter within a much longer story. This realization naturally changes priorities. It encourages wisdom over impulse, purpose over distraction, and endurance over immediate gratification. Biblical history repeatedly demonstrates that such perspective rarely develops without struggle. The wilderness was difficult, exile was painful, uncertainty was uncomfortable. Yet those very conditions often produced the clarity that prosperity alone could never provide. Through those experiences, the chosen learned to live within the world without becoming completely shaped by it. They learned to appreciate creation without mistaking it for the final destination. They learned to engage history while remembering that history itself points beyond its own boundaries. Their lives became living testimonies to a larger reality unfolding across time. From the rivers of Mesopotamia to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the deserts of Sinai to the hills of Galilee, from Babylonian exile to Roman roads, the same pattern appears repeatedly. The chosen move through the world, contribute to the world, influence the world, and serve within the world, yet their deepest identity remains anchored beyond the structures surrounding them. That is why they often feel detached. They are not disconnected from reality. They are becoming aware of a reality larger than the one most people see. Their journeys reveal that detachment is not the end of the story. It is the consequence of seeing farther down the road than the crowd, farther across the landscape than the horizon suggests, and farther into history than the present moment allows. The chosen walk through the same world as everyone else, but they increasingly recognize that the road beneath their feet ultimately leads beyond every kingdom, beyond every generation, beyond every achievement, and beyond every temporary structure that history leaves behind.